So let's kick this off. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our LSE Cities public event on Beyond the Car Divide, Fair Transport Policy for an Autonomous Mobility Future. My name is Philip Rode. I'm the Executive Director of LSE Cities, which is one of about 20 centres here at the London School of Economics, focusing, in our case, of course, on cities where the question of car use, the future of autonomous vehicles is quite fundamental. Now, today's event is supported by the LSE Research Impact Fund, facilitating follow-up research for a pan-European, relatively big research program called My Fair Share, which stands for Individual Mobility Budgets as the foundation for social and ethical carbon reduction. And through this work, we actually, over 3-4 years, got much closer to the question of space consumption in cities by particular transport modes, which, of course, we will indirectly also talk a lot about tonight. So I will set the scene for tonight's panel in a moment, but first let me welcome and introduce our distinguished panel here of experts and present the structure for tonight. In no particular order, we have with us Isabel Dedrin, who leads Arab's global transport business and has been a member of the Arab board since 2019. Prior to joining Arab, and the Londoners in the room will know this, she has, of course, been our Deputy Mayor in Transport and been the Deputy Chair of Transport for London. Whilst in her London government time, she has been leading a whole range of programs. Many have also focused on big infrastructure, among them $1 billion program for cycling. So all the cyclists in the room be very happy for her tenure, including me. 4 billion on roads investment, and then a couple of very major transport construction projects, including the London Underground extension and the devolution of rail services. She has also led on the London Infrastructure Plan 2050, which was one of the unique moments where London actually thought for the very long term or into the very long distant future of how our infrastructure should develop. Isabel is a native New Yorker and a qualified lawyer and a fellow of the Institute of Civil Engineers. We then have at the other end of our panel, Rebecca Posner, who is a behavioral psychologist specializing in human-centered mobility. She is a director of research at the Research Institute for Disabled Consumers and leads national programs of inclusive research to understand the requirements and barriers disabled people face across transport and society, and develops the solutions to meet and address their needs. Rebecca has led flagship research programs such as the Center for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles program of social and human factors research and behavioral change in relation to self-driving vehicles. And this includes the UK's largest study to date on public perceptions on self-driving vehicles. Then we move to Sarah Barnes, who is a former student of the LSE, so welcome back to your alma mater. And Sarah has spent a decade working on and researching the future of urban mobility at the intersection of tech and transport. She spent 5 years working for Lyft's micromobility team, launching new schemes and products from Mexico City to London. She runs a consultancy practice working with private and public sector organizations and wants to take a people-first approach to mobility offerings. Alongside this, Sarah is offering a weekly newsletter about autonomous vehicles called Along for the Ride, and I very much recommend signing up for that one. This helped enormously to prepare this event as well. And last but not least, Glenn Lyons, who is the Mott MacDonald Professor of Future Mobility at the University of West of England in Bristol, and the immediate past president of the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation. He has been seconded into the UK Department for Transport and the New Zealand Ministry of Transport, and over the past 8 years, also part-time into Mott MacDonald. That's a major sort of engineering transport firm. He has worked extensively to bring forward the vision-led decide and provide. So for transport people, you will, of course, know sort of the very big prominence of predict and provide, and this is sort of the alternative progressive offering of decide and provide planning, a paradigm which he has pushed. And he's the lead author of a practitioner's guide on triple access planning, so shifting also into the notion of accessibility and away just from transport and movement. Glenn developed a novel methodology to bring proponents of and opponents to driverless cars together in a constructive dialogue to establish principles to help steer a beneficial course forward for society. Now, we also had one additional guest, our current Deputy Mayor, Seb Dance, who unfortunately, at short notice, was required to assist with jury service, so he will not be able to join us. But I'm sure we will be able to give you powerful insights on what's around the corner and how we make sense of it in relation to autonomous vehicles. Now, the way we're going to run tonight is first, I'll set the scene with a quick presentation. Then we have 4 times 5 minutes opening statements by our panelists, 20 minutes panel discussion, and then, most importantly, 30 minutes of Q&A, where we really want to engage with you and our audience online. There's a social media hashtag, and I should tell everyone that we are indeed recording this session, so you are aware of it, and you may appear on YouTube if I have a particularly good question tonight. Let me move to this scene-setting presentation. A lot of this will be familiar. So beyond the car divide, there's a bit of a promise to say, if we move away from car ownership, maybe we are no longer differentiating car owners or car users and those that do not, and instead it's opening up a future where this is all an integrated form of mobility. Now that's, of course, to a large extent theory, as we will also hear in a moment. The fundamental idea and vision and hope that at some point we'll drive autonomously is not new, and engineers have been playing with ideas around that for some time. What is new is that, to some extent, it's becoming a reality. This is a photograph from Shanghai, where the firm Baidu operates large fleets of these robo-taxis. Both in the United States and in China, there are roughly between 2,000 to 3,000 vehicles at the moment in operation. That's actually rather small, so keep that figure in mind. But the stuff is coming to London, and according to some speculation, it may be the first city worldwide where both American and US firms are trialing their concepts, their vehicles, and also their service offer. And this has, of course, led to a considerable debate about what it means to a city like London, what it means to also embrace autonomous mobility in a European city that has many good mobility alternatives already in place. Now, this is hopefully familiar to many of you, hype, and the hype cycle by Gardner. It's important to recognize that the autonomous vehicle story has really been going up and down. The hype cycle, many will remember that probably in 2016-17, there was an expectation that before the 2020s, we will all be in autonomous vehicles. That didn't happen. There's this wonderful trough of disillusionment, the moment where everything sort of slides down and we realize technology isn't ready. However, there's then the slope of enlightenment, and it's probably fair to say we'll discuss a lot of technologies today that are now on the up again. So it's slowly going to happen. So in the short term, we overestimate technological impacts. In the long run, we may be underestimating it, to quote Ray Kurzweil. Now, a big debate is to what extent are these actually autonomous vehicles or just remote control vehicles? A lot of them, in fact, all of them, still have drivers, sometimes on other continents, backing up the system and intervening proactively with this wonderful red button, i.e., I take over from here. And that's been sort of one of the big stories which, in the debate about how reliable this technology actually is, remains rather unclear. But what is clear is that it is happening. There are cities where you can go and already use robo-taxis. And that there's also, when we are thinking here at the rollout, this is from McKinsey, estimation when it's finally happening, and we're thinking about different regions of the year where this becomes mass deployed, Europe tends to be last. There are all sorts of reasons why that may be the case, partially also our regulatory environments, our attitude to testing and trialing, and maybe the complexity of our road systems. But maybe also because we have a lot of alternative mobility offers already in place. You can see that even over the last years, the estimates continue to slip, but it's no longer as dramatic as, oh, this requires another 10 years. We're pretty much now talking about the next couple of years where this becomes a reality. Now, that has, from the beginning, caused a lot of thinking, particularly amongst people that are not directly within the transport space, but that deeply care about cities and urban politics and policy. And I want to quote here Jean-Louis Missika, who actually a few years ago was also standing on this very lectern, a former deputy mayor of Paris, who said in 2018 already in his book, if we do not start thinking and acting now about how autonomous vehicles reshape our streets and our public space, we risk leaving the future of urban mobility in the hands of platforms and algorithms rather than cities governed democratically. Now, since then, professional communities, academics have come together and discussed this thing, but I'm not aware of a bigger, major public engagement inviting really civil society to define what do we want from this technology. And I think that's probably a major shortcoming. So where we stand at the moment is the field can be divided into maybe optimists and pessimists, now particularly in relation what this means for cities. The optimists would argue wonderful opportunity to reduce the total number of vehicles, substantially reduce parking, maybe go even close to zero, creating opportunities for more equitable multimodal transport, fewer trips, and even more car-free areas. That's one aspect. But they're also pessimists. Now, from an urban perspective, pessimists, this would less be a pessimist if you work for Mercedes-Benz. Massive risk of this leading to far more car travel, even something which we may want to call ghost car traffic and congestion, i.e. without any people in them. Suburbanization, more sprawl, longer distances and travel times. Why? Because we can become productive while being driven. You can watch Netflix, you can have your whatever sessions with colleagues while being even stuck forever in congestion. Many open questions remain. I will not go through these, but this will occupy us over the next 60 minutes and more. Maybe to take out one that is particularly important is whether cities should really embrace both shared, public, and private autonomous vehicles, or whether there should be a very strong preference for one or the other. So autonomous vehicles, although in the public debate at the moment, is mostly considered sort of the private offering, a bit what, again, Mercedes, bottom left, is sort of putting on display and is marketing. And then on the other hand, the robo-taxis. But if you really are thinking about the broader application of the term, a vast variety of options. Big buses, smaller buses, micro-taxis, even sort of the small little pizza robot that was seen in London a few years ago is an autonomous vehicle. Now, when this stuff started, there were interesting engineering calculations, what it means for cities. One of the first studies I was made aware of was by MIT in 2014. They looked at Singapore and argued that if we were really able to shift to shared mobility on-demand systems, we would be able to reduce the number of vehicles that are currently in circulation in Singapore by a third, providing full mobility for everyone. That's including everyone who's currently traveling public transport. If you only look at car use, there was then a second follow-up study on Lisbon. It immediately reduced the current car fleet to 5%. So that was sort of the good news, the optimist perspective. Now, what's clearly behind all of this is a much more difficult conversation when we use our streets and when we also embrace autonomous vehicles. How do we ensure that this is a fair system? And that's where a connection needs to be made, which currently is hardly sort of met in the public debate around who uses it, how often, how much is it, and then also considers not only the distributional fairness, but questions of procedural fairness. How are we making collective decisions about which companies with what offerings should be allowed to run in our streets? And also questions of absolute fairness about minimum standards, which we want to guarantee maybe across the societies we are working for. I want to leave you with a few stats here. The first is the distribution of the daily distance traveled by car across income groups in London. And what we can see here quite clearly in pink, this is the average of all drivers that currently drive by income group, that this tends to be a much more pronounced habit amongst people that are wealthier. There's a small dip amongst higher middle income earners, but broadly the trend is the richer you are, the more you tend to drive. If you were to do this in emerging economy cities, it would almost be exponential towards the richer end. The black tells us that the majority of people, of course, don't drive, particularly not in inner London, and that average also follows more or less the trend of car drivers in terms of very poor people driving extremely few incidences. Finally, road space availability, and that's of course where a huge consensus exists in Europe. We do not want to expand the road capacity in our inner cities. If anything, probably reduce it further. So in London, that means we are left essentially with about 5 square kilometers of A roads, which we can utilize for driving, all sorts of driving. We currently have 2.6 million cars in circulation in Greater London. About 1 million of these drive in inner London, and then you can do the maths of how much driving you can do over a 12-hour period, 3-hour period, or even below. Just on the basis of that number of vehicles, 3 kilometers per day over a 3-hour period. Now, if everyone wanted to drive, you end up with 300 meters per day. So we have to have a serious conversation about how we distribute this good of being able to be driven individually in your own car, or indeed in an autonomous car or a black taxi. And that, of course, is something which is hardly happening at the moment. Now, here at the LSE, and this is where it links to our program, we are just launching, and this is the beta launch of a tool which we call Urban Miles. How much driving can we do? For any city, any region in the world, you can go to this tool and calculate the road capacity and translate it into a daily, hourly amount of kilometers that can be traveled per person. And that is something which we hope will facilitate the deliberation around also what do we want from autonomous vehicles. Thank you very much. So let's now move to our panel discussion, and we will start in the opposite order, and I'll ask Rebecca first to come in.
Yeah, absolutely. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to be here. I thought I would actually start my remarks by going back to basics a little bit and doing a little bit of myth busting, which I think is quite important for the context of today. So firstly, I think one thing that's really important to remember within the transport space is the distinction between technological problems and real-world problems, societal problems. If you look at this in the case of autonomy, the technological problem here is about how do we ensure that vehicles are able to drive from A to B safely without the need for human intervention. If we look at it from a societal problem, it's how do we design transport systems that are inclusive, safe, and sustainable by design. The trap that we tend to fall into quite frequently in the transport sector is we have technological solutions, and we then try and retrofit or design a problem to justify why we had that solution in the first place. What we need to make sure we do is that we don't fall into that same trap with autonomy. Now, automation has the potential, if developed well, deployed well, governed well, to actually address real long-standing issues within the transport sector in terms of transport offering and so on. But it's only if it's designed, deployed, and governed well. And by that, I mean that we are working towards public acceptability and not public acceptance. And the key distinction here is that we should be working towards a system which is public acceptability, which is that we have built a system that is worthy of trust, that it meets the demands and the requirements of various users, stakeholders, so that it is worthy of that trust. And not public acceptance, which is just that we force or require or demand trust regardless of that solution or that use case. That's the first sort of distinction and slight myth that I think is worth specifying. The second one is, and there's two parts to this, which is there are still some common assumptions that we allow to happen within the autonomy space, which is that the general public will want to use automated vehicles regardless of the use case. We know that that's not true. That's been well demystified and disproven over some big programs of research and engagement consistently. The second one, and I think this is a really important one, is that the general public don't actually know the benefits, the potential benefits of automation. When we engage with people cold, they tend to have never really considered, thought about, delved into the potential benefits of automation. So they don't know what we're talking about in terms of benefits to safety or demand management or those things, and they've never really considered the plethora of different use cases that automation could be applied to. It's only really when we start to delve through proper programs of engagement and research that we're able to identify what those use cases may be, where there is actually a real societal problem that autonomy could be a solution to, that we start to understand user demands, their needs, their expectations, and that includes any kind of governance and policies around that. The case of robo-taxis is a really interesting one because it's generally one that is governing the media, but it's often met with real mixed emotions by the general public. It's often perceived as a gadget, something that is an experience, a ride, can't wait to try it, all of those sort of language and terminologies that we see, and it's one that's really associated with wealth. one that is generally seen as a type of service that is only going to be able to be used by those who are wealthy enough to be able to afford those vehicles, either in a private sense or access to those services. And this is where that distinction between technological problem and societal problem becomes really, really important when we're looking at this in the context of London or major urban cities such as London. If we're looking at this from a technological problem, the use case of robotaxis within central London makes complete sense. Because if you can demonstrate within an environment as complex as London that you have a technology that is able to drive from A to B safely, regardless of the road environment, regardless of the complex unexpectability that is London, then the strives towards addressing that technological problem are huge. And you can take and embed those learnings into regulation, into standard design, into education, and feeding those into the use cases that the public actually want to see autonomy used for. But if we look at it from a societal problem, that's where it doesn't really make sense. What real-world transport problem is a robo-taxi in a city as transport-rich and dense as London actually addressing? Now, the argument that's often used is that it's about accessibility or access to transport, and I would challenge that with for who? Because unless these services, and not just the vehicles, but the services as a whole, are designed to be inclusive by design, and by that I mean that there is a guaranteed end-to-end physical and digital accessibility, so that includes booking, journey planning, first, last mile, integration with public transport infrastructure or broader road infrastructure, interaction with the vehicles, both as a user but also as another road user for everyone, unless we consider availability, affordability, and we're proactively addressing existing transport barriers within taxis and public transport services within the design of these services, then who are we actually improving transport for? The risk that we're seeing, the sort of real world problem, if we say, for robotaxis, if we don't consider this, is that we're not actually building for disabled people. And I'll use that use case specifically in terms of sort of my professional hat, but if we're not building systems that are inclusive by design, we are not designing for disabled people. And to give you some context, that's about 16.8 million people in the UK, or about 24% of the population. So what we're doing is that we're building transport systems that are the only real world problem, there's a question mark over the world problem, that we are really addressing, is we're just providing another option for people that already have a wealth of different transport options available to them. We're not actually addressing or recognizing the broader societal goals or challenges that are faced by cities at the moment, and we're not addressing the barriers that disabled people and many people with protected characteristics are currently experiencing in terms of accessing transport. If anything, we're introducing a wealth of different ones, a wealth of new ones. And so I'll sort of conclude my remarks, I'm pretty sure I'm coming up to 5 minutes, is that the positive side of this is that we actually have a wealth of knowledge already about the types of use cases that the general public want, the design requirements in terms of vehicles and services that the public want, regulation requirements, government safety expectations. So we don't need to be going and reinventing the wheel. What we do need to make sure is that we're not taking a technology first or a technology driven approach the design of automated vehicles, but we are making sure we're staying in one that's grounded in that human-centered approach and really trying to address what the real-world problem is. And I'm not sure that robo-taxis in London is really it.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Let's immediately move to Sarah.
Thank you. Okay, for the past decade, I have been researching and writing about autonomous vehicles via my newsletter, Along for the Ride. And I also lived in San Francisco between 2020 and 2024, which means I was living in the belly of the beast in terms of autonomous vehicle development. Out of curiosity, I would like to know who in the room has ridden in an autonomous vehicle before. Okay, this is a higher mix than I would have expected, but I'm sure those in the room would validate my feelings, which is that riding an autonomous vehicle is sort of summarized by being remarkably dull. A lot of people ride in them and feel like they can forget that there's actually not another human being there. That is up until the autonomous vehicle perhaps drives into wet concrete or surpasses a school bus full of children that are exiting after school in Austin, Texas, or perhaps drives into an active crime scene, as it recently did in Los Angeles. Autonomous vehicles, I think, are vehicles that are still in development and thus make mistakes that human drivers wouldn't necessarily know how to make. AVs were launched also with a strict rules-based approach, which means that they, at one point, had a very clear if/then scenario. If it approaches a stop sign, it comes to a complete stop. Having lived in San Francisco, I can tell you that the autonomous vehicles there have learned how to do the classic human driver rolling stop, which is really fun when you're in the intersection and the car is still driving at you. But now they tend to use learning models that learn from the other human drivers around them, because the autonomous vehicle companies themselves say that the first rules-based model isn't scalable. The idea that the vehicle could actually follow the rules of the road when everyone else is driving in the way that humans do isn't something that they can conceivably see as being safe, because there's too much mismanagement of driving practices. In 2015, Elon Musk said that Tesla would have autonomous robotaxis ready by 2018. He successfully launched his first robotaxi program last year in Austin, Texas, and the news headlines last week read that Tesla's robotaxis are currently engaged in 4 times as many collisions as the average human driver. So I would say that's not going splendidly well for Mr. Musk, amongst other things that are not going splendidly well for him. But over the course of the past decade, the pendulum has swung rapidly, from many promises of solving road deaths to the first road death that happened in 2017, which was Elaine Herzog, who was walking across the street in Tempe, Arizona, when she was hit and killed by an Uber robotaxi that was in testing. If we fast forward to 2023, a woman in San Francisco was hit by a robotaxi and dragged 20 feet. She's still unnamed. We don't have any details about her or her condition. And Cruise had originally withheld that information of the dragging from the regulatory bodies when it happened, which of course degrades the public trust that Rebecca has just been talking about. The past decade has been full of these promises made and broken, and I could spend our entire evening talking about the reality TV worthy drama that has predated the industry, but I will save that for another time or the pub. Instead, I want to focus on the one promise that all of these companies really focus on, which is the promise of saving human lives. In many ways, it's become a marketing strategy. If you go to Waymo's webpage, on their homepage, they list 3 really important statistics. The first is that globally, 1.2 million people die from traffic crashes every year. The second is that the value of those crashes is an estimated $836 billion globally from loss of human life and injury. And then the last is that in the US alone, there were 42,000 deaths in 2022. They did not update the numbers for 2023, 2024, and 2025 because they are all lower than 2022, and that would not necessarily align with their marketing strategy that their vehicles will solve this problem. Another temperature check for the room. Who here thinks that autonomous vehicles can single-handedly solve our road traffic fatality problem? Okay, not a single hand. Who thinks they can help? Okay. Great, we have some optimists in the room, I like that. The narrative that these companies have chosen, one of saving lives, makes it really easy for most people not to question the intent behind the vehicle. I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that autonomous vehicles really originated in 2004, when the US military put forward a challenge, and that the original intent behind the vehicles is for military purposes, and we've since adapted that to our cities. And so you have this technology that wasn't designed to make streets safer or to save lives. If anything, it was potentially the opposite. And despite all of the hubbub that happens in the news, Waymo is actually only active in 6 US cities. You would think it would be in a million based on how often they are in the news, but it is only 6. It is San Francisco, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Austin, Miami, and Atlanta. And each of those cities does have very real traffic problems. In doing some research, I learned that both LA and Atlanta had more traffic fatalities than homicides last year. However, only one of those gets sensationalized in the media as being a problem. An audit of why LA hasn't reached its Vision Zero goals yet detailed a lack of cohesion from different city departments, an insufficient amount of political support, and an imbalanced approach to actually implementing infrastructure. But we've seen cities from Helsinki to Hoboken actually succeed in reaching their Vision Zero goals. In London, we've seen low traffic neighborhoods decrease injuries and deaths by 1/3 within the boundaries of those projects. As every AV company actually sets their sights on London, they promise to reduce road deaths and traffic collisions, but they also wager that there will be some fatalities involved in that rollout. In November, the Waymo CEO went on the record saying that the world was now potentially ready for a death by an autonomous vehicle incident. She said that mere days before a Waymo hit and killed a cat in San Francisco, and the entire city erupted in protest and calls for stricter regulation. And I personally don't think that any road death is something that society will view as being acceptable. I think we do have to get to zero. And as Waymo says that they want to tackle the 1.2 million traffic fatalities that happen every year, they also have to contend with the fact that 60% of those fatalities do not happen in cities. They happen in rural roads and rural areas, notably not to where Waymo is targeting at this particular point. They're going directly to urban centers like London that have public transport networks and coverage that their product will compete with. They're hell-bent on bringing cars to urban centers that are actively trying to reduce their car usage and demand. They also want to introduce a vehicle model that we all know, which is a taxi-esque model, something you can order directly to your home and have it drop you off very nicely at your end destination. But they're not betting on the bus. They want to bring a solution that is the same model and mode of transportation that we have today, just minus the labor cost of having a driver, which sort of brings us to the capitalism of it all. If AVs do not tangibly improve street safety as measured by the number of people whose lives are saved, who have fewer killed and seriously injured stats, and reduce the number of traffic collisions themselves, but are profitable, I guarantee the technology is not going to go anywhere. However, in the inverse, if the technology saves many lives, but they can't figure out how to make it profitable, will these companies continue to operate and spend the vast amount of money that they do in our cities to try and deliver this service, or will they sell it out to an auto OEM to just bake it into their next model of direct-to-consumer cars? And the companies aren't interested in improving access to transit. If so, their focus would not be on a city like London. It would be elsewhere in the UK, where there are very real transit deserts and concerns around actually connecting people to the places that they need to live their life. So as these companies look to London, the question I have for this audience and many members of government is, do we actually need this technology? Can we reach zero traffic fatalities without also bringing more cars to London streets? Is the future we want to be roving around in London, isolated in a private AV, on our way to a planet designed by the wonderful animators who made WALL-E, the movie? Or should we face potentially political backlash by imagining something that is far more radical, a truly just transport system that doesn't further condemn us to the automobile industry and its ever-growing need for profit?
Sarah, thank you very much. Let's move to Glenn.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Lovely to be here. Maybe you're looking at me thinking perhaps he's going to be the evangelist in the lineup. Prepare to have your expectations managed. I'm pleased, Sarah, that in your commentary there were lots of questions, and I think that's reflective of the territory we're inhabiting at the moment. And at the top of my notes is the question, if robo-taxis are the answer, what on earth was the question? I'm reminding myself that 32 years ago, I finished my PhD, which was in using artificial neural networks to model driver behavior. Didn't quite realize where I was heading. This month, Waymo rather proudly announced that it had clocked up 200 million miles of robot-driven movement around networks in the US. Sounds like a big number. However, in the US last year, 3.2 trillion motor vehicle miles were driven, which means Waymo is knocking on the door of less than 1/100th of 1% of the problem or opportunity, depending on how you look at it. And so it's a sobering reminder that to achieve whatever driverless cars are intended to achieve at a systems level isn't coming quickly. Let's just take then an example of road safety, which seems to be at the heart of this. If you were serious about trying to address road deaths, of which, as Sarah's pointed out, I think the latest year is 39,000 deaths in the US, you'd want to move quickly, because hanging around for another decade or two is clocking up a lot of fatality, never mind serious injured. Let's move across to the UK. Let's zoom in on Wales, where a very, very low-tech solution of moving speed limits from 30 miles an hour down to 20 miles an hour in built-up areas, which affected a third of the nation's roads by length overnight, reduced recorded casualties on the affected roads by over a quarter in its first year. Now that sounds a hell of a lot more exciting to me than tinkering around waiting to see what billionaire toys in our streets of London might do around the edges. So a sobering reminder that the promised mobility revolution, every revolution we are promised, requires decades of patience. Don't forget, by the way, that these machines at the moment do have a caretaker workforce for these so-called edge cases that they don't know how to cope with. The cat on the road, the rather frustrating burgeoning numbers of cyclists in London streets, let alone the pedestrians rushing to get to the nearest bus stop or tube station. And I think what's apparent to me, and it's echoing what Rebecca said, is the phrase, beware of being seduced by the siren sound of technology. And I'm sorry to say, time and time again, around the world, our governments are seduced by the siren sound of technology. You'll hear the phrases trotted out time and time again. Jobs, opportunities, inward investment, wealth creation, economic prosperity. And it's all part of a race mentality that somehow we get drawn into time and time again. As Rebecca said, it's really important to know what exam question you're answering, because the necessary but not sufficient question is how to get a machine from A to B, taking a human occupant without them being harmed or anyone else on the road network. It's much harder to confront the wicked problem, which is how to ensure driverless vehicles deliver societal impact that is acceptable and beneficial. So, without sounding too trite, we really have to make sure we're asking here in London, what can robo-taxis do for London, not what can London do for robo-taxis? And Adam Tranter, if he were here, very quickly when we got news that Waymo was on its way, singled in on the problem of jaywalking. And apparently we're told it's quite frustrating that London doesn't have jaywalking. It's not illegal to cross the road at a non-designated point. Can you imagine what would happen if Waymo said we can deliver some of the benefits we promised, but please could you get your pedestrians to behave? And by the way, make sure the cycling boom keeps in its own lane. And of course, the phrase all else being equal is very tempting to be drawn into. But the reality is all else won't be equal. We're not simply replacing human control of a vehicle by machine control of a vehicle in the name of safety. There will be a myriad of unintended consequences, as you nicely illustrated at the beginning. And I would just like to emphasize before I finish a point that Rebecca made, which is that it's all too easy to be drawn into asking the public whether robo-taxis are acceptable. So, sorry, I got that the wrong way around. We focus too much on how we persuade the public that they will be acceptable, rather than asking a very open, well-informed question. If you're aware of the full consequences that could unfold, would you consider it an acceptable journey to embark upon? So I'll just finish, I think, with a rather light-hearted reminder that Rebecca also had, which is a robo-taxi ride has been likened by our famous black cab drivers to a fairground attraction. It is appealing in and of itself, perhaps, for those of you who've had a go, but it's not necessarily the sort of societal game changer that we might be wishing for. Thank you.
Lynn, thank you very much. Let's hope now that Isabel will make the case for robo-taxis in London. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Philip. Great to be here. I think the perspective that I can provide here is I worked within the Transport for London structure for many years, and then at City Hall as well. So within a city environment. So what's happening on this question within urban agencies, whether city halls, whether transit agencies, and what's the lived experience of this question in that context? And now in my new job, I work with cities around the world on these sorts of questions. So not just a London view. I guess everyone's already said it. This is a problem in search of it's a solution in search of a problem. And one of the things that happens when you work in a city hall environment is technology companies and other companies come all the time to be like, you need this thing. And you're like, where's the starting point, which is we have this challenge in this city and here's how my thing can help with the challenge. So this is a universal problem that goes beyond robo taxis. It's the kind of endless barrage of new solutions that you never knew you needed. And so this is just the latest in that flow. So it's probably worth situating it a little bit in that context. The second thing I was going to sort of try and illuminate is there's also the institutional setting into which these proposals are being made. So traditionally, if you look at an urban transport agency, there's the stuff that we build and run ourselves, the tube, and there's things we don't do anything about. Car, bicycle, you're on your own, knock yourself out. And then in the middle, there's sort of, possibly deregulated, franchise operated. In London, that would be the bus network. What's happening with all of these new technologies, including autonomous vehicles, is they're coming into that institutional environment, but we don't understand them. It's not something that we own and operate, the tube. It's not something that we're totally hands-off on. So the agencies of urban transport are not able to respond institutionally to these proposals as they come in, which means they end up bouncing around a lot, and it's sort of, the reaction from a mayor, from someone running a transit agency is, I guess we maybe need one of these. So let's have one or two, and let's have a pilot, and let's make sure we're not left behind, and always want to know what's Paris doing, and they may be getting a jump on us. And so you kind of want enough action that you can be seen to be on the front foot, really innovative, technological, but that's really where it starts and stops, partly because there isn't a kind of institutional capability to have a more structured, systematic, and strategic response to this technology that's coming into the system and saying, is there a value to this thing? And if so, what would it be? And that leads me on to the sort of last point, really, which is what cities, as a result of this kind of explosion in micromobility, scooters, e-scooters, you name it. Uber was another example of the same thing. Huge numbers of new technologies and new business models coming into the urban transport environment. So you had city agencies, transport agencies, massively on the back foot. Do we allow this? How much of it? How fast can they go? All that stuff. And nobody's got the time and the breathing space to say, what is the problem that I've got? How might this technology help tackle that problem? And what do I need to do as a proactive regulator and policymaker to create the correct policy framework for this? And there's a very small number of cities that are getting this right. I think one example would be some work that New York is doing around electric vehicles and how could shared electric vehicles be a solution in transit deserts, as opposed to put your electric vehicles wherever you want them. So there's that kind of smart, proactive regulator role that the city can and must play, but currently it is really struggling to play in the face of this sort of onslaught of proposals and the desire to be seen to be on the front foot in this area. So there's a quite interesting dynamic that I think has been in effect for the last, at least 5 or 10 years, and only very slowly are cities starting to now kind of turn the tide on that. So for me, this question sits within the city decision-making and institutional context. And in that context, unfortunately, that would also lead you down the road of saying, this isn't happening in those timescales that you've set out. It's far more complex than that. There isn't a clear political issue that this is addressing, and I mean political in the sense of what is the public after, and therefore I don't see that changing really anytime soon.
Thank you very much, Isabel. So you are now putting me on the spot as neutral chair to not only be neutral and to offer you a few cases which people may want to put forward, even in cities, that this is a very good thing and that there is a real problem and this is the solution. So I'm going to offer you two possible answers or propositions, and then we can go around the panel, choose one of my provocations and just see how that sits with you. So the first one is, I would say, we do have a massive problem of car use, even in London. And we certainly have a massive problem of parking, even in inner London, certainly in outer London. I mean, the amount of space we dedicate as storage space, public space, as storage space to machines only used 3% of the time. The latest figure I got from Berlin, the average car in Berlin is used 17 minutes per day, right? That's all. So, and it's using prime urban space. That is a bloody big problem. And the promise here is to liberate the use of vehicles at moments where we need maybe a personal space to be moved for whatever reason, go to the hospital, go to the airport with the family, to disconnect this from having to own this thing and maybe have greater affordability in those few moments. You can even have progressive pricing and you can use it once, twice a month, and then it really kicks in to allow everyone to use the comfort of a personal car being driven. That's point number one. Point number two, if you talk in Europe to people that operate public transport and you ask them what's their biggest worry, you often get to two answers. It's very expensive to operate and the staff costs are through the roof, and that's why we, as a sort of public bodies often, we are really worried about the costs of it. We recognize it's very important, we need to subsidize it, but the costs are going through the roof and labor is a huge problem for us. And on top of this, we no longer have enough drivers anyway. Yeah? Lots of European cities struggle to find the bus drivers, the train drivers, the tram drivers, and so on. So I know of many people that would love to use autonomous vehicle technique for buses, for trams, for trains, and so on. And the last point is once again around really avoiding this lock-in of ownership, where at the point of purchase, you essentially make a decision of how you move for the next 10 years. Because you're not paying the upfront cost for driving through the purchase of a vehicle, but instead by trip. You may actually, in the long term, use vehicles, private vehicles, and by that I mean, yes, an autonomous vehicle that is shared, but in the moment you use it for private motion and moving without others, far less frequently, as opposed to if you purchase it upfront. So let's hear from the panel in response to any of the statements, what they think about it, and then we'll open it up to everyone in the room. And let's maybe do it in inverse order. Isabel.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, I think your first point around the, what's the role of the autonomous car and where could it play a role? That is what I was trying to say in terms of the city being a proactive policymaker, right? So let's look at all the movement and then let's isolate those movements that, can't be made by bicycle, tube, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a significant issue, which when you work in a political environment, you really understand much more deeply because we tend to be central London, inner London people. Like everyone takes the tube everywhere. What's the problem? Why do these people have cars? If you live in Barnet where there's a horse paddock next to your house, you know why people use cars and you're still in London. So I think there is, there may be a role for it, but the starting point has to be a framing from the city's perspective about what are we actually trying to do, as all of us have said in different ways. The other thing I'd just quickly say is all the points you've made there could be made about shared ownership minus the autonomy. And we have shared vehicles, and the uptake's been not brilliant in cities around the world. So there is something there about this is a thing that exists, minus robots, and people aren't using loads of them, and they deliver all the benefits you've described, and yet, there is a limiting factor in the uptake. So what can we learn from that rather than blindly throwing ourselves at the next iteration of the same technology?
Thank you very much. Glenn.
Thank you. Well, to your first question, I just wrote down taxis. I mean, it seems remarkable to me. Why don't we invent an idea where humans could be employed to drive machines around in case other humans needed picking up? It would kind of be like public transport, but just with fewer people in it. And we could make it worldwide. We've got it. So you have to then ask, well, what's the differentiator here? It might be safety. Let's remind ourselves that in 2024, there were no fatalities as people using black cabs in London. There were some killed or seriously injured statistics for black cabs and for ride-hailed vehicles, but the numbers in relative terms are pretty modest. So it's not a dangerous sport to get a taxi in London. That's the first point. Incidentally, I spoke to somebody who is in charge of a company trying to bring autonomous capability into public transport fleets. And he asked me, this was last year, he said, have a guess how much it really costs for one of these exciting fair rides in, let's say, San Francisco. And I thought, I'll pick a big number, $100, $1,000 apparently. It's a bit like having a lab-grown burger. You know, right now it's going to cost an arm and a leg to have a lab-grown burger. When we come to public transport, absolutely, the driver is the big problem in a narrow margin industry. But that human being is not just the driver, much as we try to isolate them in a cab sometimes. You know, if we didn't have the driver, we'd very quickly come to your territory, Rebecca, and say, well, how are all these people with a whole myriad of different needs, from pushchairs and wheelchairs to vulnerability and anxiety, going to be assured to go about their lives in a public arena? The last thing we want are machines with no human presence, and I doubt we'd get that. And to your last point, I think, do we want cities without cars? I think what was beautiful about what's happened in Paris through Mayor Hidalgo was a realization, if I understand it, that most people in Paris don't own a car. So you're preaching to the converted by introducing what appear to be quite radical measures to transform, in a sort of tactical urbanism type way, the city environment and rebalance the share of space between humans and machines. And so I think, you know, there are opportunities to achieve the end goals without this being the solution or the only solution that we're considering.
Thank you, Glenn and Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, the first point really reminded me, or what it evoked for me, was the current downfall of Zipcar in London and the UK, and how that service was really beloved by a lot of users who didn't want to own a private vehicle in their life. The whole crowd is currently nodding, like everyone is like, yes, I love my Zipcar membership. Because you didn't want to use a car every day, but maybe you had to go to IKEA or, you know, the odd trip, and it was very useful. And I think what's really difficult about that type of use case is that Zipcar didn't really have the support it needed from the public institutions to operate in that, like, you know, instead of owning a private vehicle, you allow people this shared access, but it needed almost public subsidy, public support in order to be able to exist, because it couldn't turn a profit under that current measure, because as Glenn's pointed out, you know, the popularity kind of ebbs and flows from it, but it still provides a really good urban utility. And I think, again, regardless of if there is autonomy or not, it's really helpful in, you know, those odd use cases. And then I think when it comes to public transport, labor is such an interesting thing, because also within the autonomous vehicle industry, there's lots of concern around job loss. And, you know, being a bus driver can feel weird to say in a room full of academics and people who have, you know, professional careers that pay them handsomely. I may be making assumptions for all of you here. But being a bus driver is a really good job. You know, like it's a really noble and important job that exists in society, and it's not just helping somebody get on and off of a bus because different people have different mobility needs. It's making sure that, like, the little 12-year-old boys on the bus aren't, like, completely wrecking havoc too. Like, you provide a sense of social order. Your job is not just A to B, it's very much so a piece of social cohesion that exists in the world. And I think that can't be replaced. And when I also think of things around public safety and the experience of being a woman on public transport, sometimes it's really nice to know that there's another human being who's actually responsible for this particular bus or this particular carriage, who, if something, see something, say something, sort it, that person is there to sort it, like, immediately, in that moment. You don't have to call somebody. One of the things that I see a lot writing about autonomous vehicles is that right now it's like the wild, wild west of people being, like, super funky and weird about them. And in the US, you'll get cases of somebody being like, yeah, I hailed an autonomous vehicle and then I didn't get out of it, but I ended the trip. So then somebody else goes to order it and there's a person hanging out in the back of the robotaxi just there to surprise them. Like it is a completely unsupervised mode of transportation, and I think there's a lot that we'll eventually have to contend with in terms of how that plays out.
Great. Thank you very much. And Rebecca?
Yeah, sort of drawing upon a few things that have been mentioned so far, I think if I start with the first problem, which is around the sort of reliance on car use and parking and so on. Now, we know that when we look, especially across disabled people, there is a reliance on the private car. But the reason that is often the case is because it is the only guaranteed form of accessible transport. You ask most disabled people, and they do not want to be reliant on the private car, but there is no current other alternative available. There is a real demand and drive to make public transport, walking, wheeling, cycling, micromobility more inclusive so that people don't have to rely on the private car or don't have to rely on a taxi. So if we're going, and this is the about point around end-to-end accessibility, which is if we're looking at robo-taxis or as a fleet in their introduction, unless the vehicle is guaranteed to provide that end-to-end accessibility, both physical and digital, it's not actually providing an alternative. And if we're looking at the sort of fleets of vehicles that are being considered or introduced within robo-taxis, very few of them are novel designs. Most of them are existing fleets of vehicles with a suite of sensors, sensing technology and so on that is being added onto them. So again, it's not really addressing the problem because it's not tapping into a group of users who would actively like to reduce dependency and private vehicle ownership, but don't currently have an alternative or conduit to do so. And this sort of ties into the bit about the role of the driver. There's a really brilliant piece of work that I encourage people to go and have a look at, which was commissioned by CCAB a couple of years ago, that was done by TRL, the Transport Research Laboratory, that looked at non-driving tasks of drivers of passenger services and looked to map at a sort of end-to-end level, end-to-end journey, the non-driver tasks that could be replicated in an automated system and those that could not, and where technology wouldn't be able to replicate that. And there's a wealth of different activities, exactly to the point that Glenn was saying. A driver is not just a driver. There are other responsibilities around safety, comfort, confidence that fall into that. But they're also generally provided to people who have protected characteristics, and especially disabled people, from a safety aspect. So unless we start looking at how robotaxis come into it from a mixed fleet demand management, which is actually the equivalent of right-sizing a vehicle, but matching a sort of human-driven taxi towards those who may require that additional human support versus those who do not for the purposes of undertaking a journey safely, that's where maybe that becomes interesting. But again, there is a fundamental thing that the vehicles themselves and the surface needs to be accessible. There's actually trying to maybe provide a bit of a balanced argument to all of this, which is that within public transport, if we are looking at removing the driver, there is a real opportunity to redesign the fleets of vehicles themselves and repurpose space that is currently really used in conflict. So thinking specifically around wheelchair spaces in buses, where priority area is supposed to be priority use for wheelchair users, the reality is that it is often a place that is really put in conflict between public transport users who should never be put in conflict, because what they're doing is they're trying to use a sustainable mode of transport. So there is an interesting option if we are looking at automation within public transport, which is how do we use that as an opportunity to repurpose lost space? Can the area that used to be the area where the driver is, can that be used for cycle storage? Can that be used for pram, pushchairs? Can it be used for mobility aids and so on? And then again, finally, this is kind of about that point around right-sizing. There's a really interesting trial that's going on in the suburbs of Paris, I think, at the moment, that Vinci actually are doing, which is around trialing a slightly smaller automated shuttle on a on-highway sort of solution, which is where there is already a fleet of vehicles. So it's a larger vehicle, I think it's a 60 capacity bus that is a rapid transit. So it's going on a part of the motorway to sort of like bypass Paris, which if anyone has driven around Paris is something everyone wants to do. And what they've done was actually they realized that they had a real challenge, which is at off-peak times, there was demand for that vehicle, but the vehicles that were being used and the cost of the service meant that they were actually not being able to operate that service at times where it could offer and benefit more individuals. What they're doing is they've provided two smaller fleets of vehicles, two smaller buses that are operating in automated fashion way, that is therefore operating less frequently, but actually enabling them to provide a service more frequently throughout the day. That again is a really interesting use case of how we bring this into public transport, but it's about, because it's been a real world problem first, which is actually people who are traveling off peak time are having to still rely on the car because there is no bus that we can financially operate at an off peak time. If we reduce the size of the bus, reduce the need for a driver, the drive hours requirements that fit into that, actually we're suddenly providing an option that means we're taking people actively out of private cars. So there's a few ways in which, to answer your question, we can look at it in a slightly more positive light if designed accessibly.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. So let's open this up, and what we're going to do is initially 2 rounds of 3 questions from our in-person participants, and then we'll also hear a bit from those that are joining online. Please introduce yourself very briefly. Keep your question or comment reasonably short, and that's the main rule. So let's open it up, and then we'll do it 3 times. And if colleagues want to just scribble down what is being said, also make sure if you have a question that is specific to one of our panelists. Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you, Philip. I'm Paul Bowker, Group Manager in Sustainable Transport from the London Borough of Hackney. I'm not going to address this to any of the panel. I'm just going to make a quick point. No one has mentioned that we have an MTS target of traffic reduction of 27%. No one has mentioned that we might have ghost taxis going around the city empty, doing more mileage than cars. How do we square the two?
Good. Thank you very much. Important point. The ghost taxis and ghost cars.
Hi, I'm Jinit. My question is specifically for Glenn. I do run a fleet of vehicles back in India. These are electric vehicles, and what I've realized is that almost 70 to 80% of the costs are towards the drivers of the vehicles, and specifically for electric vehicles. So I wanted to know from Glenn that reducing the cost at least say by 50%, that's what is my estimation for the trips. And you talked about the black cabs of London. How much percentage of population, especially for the poor population, has access to it? Because in what I understand, they're pretty costly.
Thank you very much. And one more, please. Put your arm very high so the stewards can see you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a really, really interesting panel. My name is Emma Budd. I'm a lawyer with environmental law charity Client Earth. And I was wondering if you could maybe comment on the environmental implications of this technology, because the story is ambivalent, to say the least, with regard to another kind of hype technology, electric vehicles, but it's a bit more of a clear-cut debate. So I'm curious on your views on this technology. Thank you.
Great, so let's take those 3. For the first one, I just want to add, and we haven't talked about private self-driving vehicles, where the ghost story may even be a bigger problem, and whether there is also a real risk that if we focus too much on the robo-taxis, are we sort of turning a blind eye on having a strong attitude in relation to privately owned autonomous vehicles? If the panelists just choose any of the questions, Glenn, there was one specifically for you. Who wants to go first? Maybe Glenn?
Okay, yeah. Thank you for your question. So if I understood correctly, it's really focused on the degree of elitism that's associated with access to these types of vehicles, or indeed to existing private hire vehicles. And I suppose my main concern here, without being able to give you figures, is more about the proprietary lock-in that we might face going forwards. So we knew, for example, when Uber arrived on the scene in many cities globally, that we were getting artificially suppressed fares that consumers were paying, which seemed seductive. It seemed a great way of pushing out the existing taxi model that we had in cities. But of course, seduced beware, because once you're in a captive market, ultimately one has to assume private sector players in the mobility space are looking to make profit. And so I think, I don't have a positive answer to what you're raising, because I think there is a very real risk that we start to squeeze out more sustainable, inclusive options for mobility and create an even more elitist situation, ironically sold to us on the ticket of an inclusive mobility solution.
Thank you. Any further volunteers?
I was just going to comment on kind of combination of the ghost car point and your question about the environmental impact. I mean, leave to one side the fact that the guy who used to run the autonomous vehicle program at Google recently said that this would be after 2050 that we would have autonomous vehicles properly, because the California motorway and the road outside are not the same place. And the computational, power that's needed if you were actually going to do it properly for a central London environment is so vast that they haven't yet figured out how you would actually go about doing that. And the environmental point is, the cost from a data center perspective to just process all of that data is, he can't even figure out how to do it. And then even if you could figure it out, you're talking about how many, thousands of acres of data centers just for what, question. But leaving that to one side, I think, Glenn, you alluded to Uber, and I was at City Hall when Uber, figured out a lot of loopholes around the world for them to swarm a lot of cities. And we were left on a very back foot type of setting, because they'd understood the regulatory structures in different cities and sort of figured out a way to suddenly, just have an explosion of vehicles in the city. So at the time, we went from 20 or 30,000 private hire vehicles to 120,000. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that it's probably quite instructive for this ghost car. What happened? So we're like, oh, that's not great. But what we'd really like is for you to help us with, car movement in outer London, where actually a private hire vehicle might be an environmentally better solution than everyone with their private car for a lot of trips that people want to make. Well, of course, they don't want to operate out there because it's not financially attractive. So that's why you got this honeypot sort of situation where you get all the Uber drivers driving around in central London, because that's where the people are. And the analysis that was done at the time by Transport for London showed very clearly that the mode shift for those trips was predominantly out of walk, bus, etc., tube. So this is not a environmentally better solution unless you can demonstrate that it's an electric vehicle that's better than who knows what from a bus standpoint. But on the basis that all of these transport technologies are moving to electric now quite rapidly, that can't be the case, that's going to be environmentally better. So I think for me, the Uber case is just a microcosm of what we could be looking at here, or another example of a similar type of.
Thank you, Isabel. Rebecca or Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah. I think EVs are a very interesting one, where how clean and environmentally sound your EV is very much so based on how clean the energy grid that you're pulling its power from. And so there's vast parts of America that are still using coal to power a lot of their plants. And so if you're going and you're charging your vehicle into your home, you're offsetting those emissions somewhere else. It's not that your EV is necessarily directly pulling clean energy all the way through. And so I think there's that element. It's more sustainable in many ways than your traditional ICE vehicle. But if you look, there's a million really good charts that look at, emissions from each mile delivered. And EVs are middle of the pack at best. And then you add in all of the data processing that we're all currently just still trying to wrap our brains around in terms of how we understand it. And then the other element of all of this is that being in an AV is an incredibly pleasant experience. They've made it so Waymo now has integrations with Spotify. So the song you were listening to in your headphones as you enter the vehicle starts exactly where you left off. If you were listening to a podcast, it'll chime right in without you having to push a button. They've made the experience so comforting and personalized that it will induce demand for more travel. And so you're going to also see this behavior change towards people taking more trips because the trip itself is really nice. There's not a person beside you who should have taken a shower this morning but didn't. There's not somebody on public transport with their like armpit in your face at 7 a.m. on the tube. Like, it's a very different experience, and it will induce demand, and that demand is something that we will also have to account for when the scale of ridership comes through in 2050, perhaps.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Yeah, and if I could just pick up on that modal shift point, which I think is really, really important. And if we look at, actually, if we go back to the example around car clubs and that shared mobility point that we were talking about earlier, there was really strong evidence that demonstrated that car clubs were a really, really powerful behavioral intervention to reduce multi-vehicle household ownership. And the evidence around it was pretty overwhelming, especially if we looked at urban environments where they were as richly and densely populated in terms of where you could access those vehicles as London. What we found was that by providing that alternative to the second car, which I realize is a little bit different, but it enabled people to sort of like get rid of that, so reducing private vehicle ownership. But more importantly, we saw that more journeys were being made by walking, wheeling, and active travel as a result of that, because the process of having to go to a vehicle meant that, like, oh, actually, it's only a few minutes more to get to that. I don't need to do my multimodal journey is active travel paired with public transport or rail and so on. It wasn't, I'm going to drive to the train station. So we actually saw some really interesting knock-on effects around that modal shift and what types of journeys were actually being replaced through, it was still access to a motorized vehicle on demand when required. The challenge we see with robo-taxis, especially if we're looking at this from a sort of end-to-end user, from an end-to-end journey, is that we're not going to see that same shift. So unless there's a fleet of vehicles that you can access that are replicating like for like the car club model, that you're effectively walking to get into a really lovely journey that matches with your Spotify playlist, which sounds delightful, to be honest, but and kind of seeing that through to the end. But the reality is that if it's coming to your door, you are not going to do, we all know, I'm sure we've all been at some point in our lives being like, I could walk home, but if I can get a parent to come and pick me up from the train station to drive me home, much better, over the bus station or so on, or that time where it's absolutely chucking it down with rain, and if you have access to a car that is on your doorstep, you're not getting on that cycle if you've got another alternative option. So if we look at it from a sort of environmental perspective, from a modal shift, there's a really interesting aspect here, which is if we make it so easy and so comfortable, we are not just going to be looking at, and I think there's a whole life cycle approach which is really interesting, and I don't have the level of knowledge to be able to comment on the earlier bits, but from a modal shift perspective, there's a very real risk that actually we are moving journeys that are, as we're trying to move towards active travel, shared forms of transport, public transport, that if we don't be very cautious, we'll be moving more journeys back onto motorised vehicles, private motorised journeys, as opposed to actually facilitating a shift towards active and public transport.
Thank you very much. Let's go to the other end of the room, and we have already, the 3 hands up there, please.
Hi, my name's Johnny. Just a question, just to unpack what Isabel was talking about. How do you think that transport regulators are going to balance the immense pressure from these companies to launch the service, and then balance that with what the city, what the transport regulator thinks the city actually needs? And what sort of things should the transport regulator be looking at when they're assessing whether this is a viable service or not? And do you think ultimately this will end up in a sort of a commissioned service, looking at that's the only way that this will feasibly work, I think.
Thank you. And the gentleman behind. Yep.
Hi, my name's Mark Bagay. I work for Transport for London. I'm curious, in your view, kind of all else being equal in a world that's similar to this one, so don't worry about geopolitics, all the rest of it. What difference will having AVs make? What will our lives be like? What will our experience of the city be like in a city which is where there's a large uptake of AVs?
Thank you. And the lady behind, thank you.
Right. Hi, I'm Kush. So I'm at the School of Public Policy, so I'm thinking about in terms of a lot of government stuff. And so I was thinking about the fact that there seems to be this mismatch between transport needs and transport technology and interventions that are coming in. And I was hoping to hear the panel's thought about like what is causing this sort of misalignment of incentives? How do we get better incentives in place so that technological interventions and innovations are more aligned to people's needs as opposed to profit, you know? Yeah, thank you.
Great. Again, any volunteers who would like to kick us off?
Well, I'll just pick up on that question. That's a great question, because I think, well, I might say this, having worked in a political environment, I think politics is part of the answer to this. I have a really positive view of politics, having worked in it, because, you know, like, it's, people say, oh, a lot of transport is political. That means it's responding to the requirements of the public. That's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. So I think politics is part of the answer to this, which sort of comes back to the policy framework, right? Because if the city sees itself as the channel for what the public actually needs, then, and can be more muscular, more proactive, more thoughtful about this, not just like, oh, brilliant people from California have come to solve this problem. Like, oh, it's not for us to question. There is a bit of the, you know, second-class citizen feeling sometimes in the public sector, and certainly in the municipal government. You know, it's like, oh, well, you know, there's some billionaire, they must know what they're doing. And it's somewhere in the psyche of decision makers in cities. And so it's being confident as a decision maker that you are here to represent the people who live in the city and moving around the city, and what is the right answer for them. So I do think the kind of political process is part of the answer. I know that sounds a bit hokey, but that's part of the answer to the question. Is, you know, sorry, maybe oversimplified, but that's one of my thoughts. Just coming back to your policy framework question, it's a great question. One of the pieces of work that we did back in the day was when we were doing the cycling program, was like, if we take all the trips in London, which are the, you know, start from 100% should be cyclable, and then let's take off. So let's figure out the maximum addressable market for cycling and remove all the things that, you know, okay, realistically, somebody who's over 80 might not cycle, you know, someone who's under 5, whatever. So, and that was how we came up with, at the time, a 5% mode share target for cycling. So I think, first of all, that kind of analysis, which is like, which are the movements here that we actually think would be best, the end-to-end movements that are best suited to this technology. So, for example, one of the issues in Outer London is, first of all, you just don't have the density that you need for public transport, but also there's a lot of these multi-point trips, you know, drop the kid at school, go to work, go to the supermarket, pick your kid up again. I almost forgot that part. It's like, go home. No, collect child from school, then go home. You know, those would be very suitable to this technology, actually, and better than using a private car, potentially. So, but it's starting from that kind of addressable market. So that analysis I don't see happening in most cities. It's, you know, it's the transport planning analysis, effectively. And then the other thing that was triggered when you mentioned that was, your point about, what's the car club that went out?
Oh, Zipcar.
Zipcar, yeah. I mean, at the time that a lot of those guys were coming into the market, they wanted the roundel. They want the kind of tube symbol on the car, and that you could open the car, not with some random card, but with an Oyster card. And, you know, we didn't do that at the time. And that's, I think, the kind of intervention that cities need to be looking at, is to fold this into the transport network and make it, you know, it should be part of the pricing system within your, you know, prepaid card or whatever it might be, or your monthly pass. So those are just two thoughts from me.
Rebecca, you want to come in?
I can do, yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that I think is really interesting, and it was to the point about what would a world with AVs actually look like. I think if we had the answer to that, we would probably be part of the sort of like, maybe the billionaires, or the kind of solution that Sarah was talking about. But I think what's really important here is that we don't forget that autonomy is not a use case, it's a technology. And by that, I mean there are actually really valid real world, especially off-highway solutions, where autonomy can have a really important role from that safety aspects. So there were some trials a couple of years ago which National Highways were doing around cone placement for roadworks and lane closures. Incredibly risky situation to be in, and actually whether that process could be automated with both the vehicle and so on, so that we weren't introducing increased risk, unnecessary risk to a lot of people. Portside, airside, off-highway, those different things there, construction, logistics, and so on. There are really valuable use cases that are often completely sort of like put in the shadows because of it's not a public road, so it's not really a problem that we have to deal with. And often they get forgotten in the use case and the potential benefits, I will say that right, of autonomy. I think when we're looking at it in terms of, it goes back to the solution, which is what's the problem that actually autonomy would be the solution for? And we've got some examples around community transport, especially they're incredibly expensive to run, but they are a lifeline for many people. Demand responsive transport, brilliant work actually at UE that was done around the societal value of demand responsive transport and community transport, and the fact that yes, they may not be financially successful, but the community aspect and what they do in terms of improving access to education, employment, community and so on is so invaluable that it is worth it. But we have to recognize that local authorities really struggling often to sort of make ends meet and make those. So where can technology actually and some of those cost savings that autonomy could bring in the longer term, it's not going to happen overnight, but where are those use cases? Actually, we've not looked at them because they're not commercially viable, they're not sexy, they're not the ones where a tech company out of Silicon Valley is going to be like, yeah, do you know what, demand responsive community transport in Wales, that's where we're going. But actually those are the use cases where there is real value, and most importantly it's where the public want to see that technology used. They want it to have that societal drive, and I realize that's a little bit idealistic, but it's important that we don't try and completely dismiss that argument. And so what does a real world look like? It's actually one where the technological solution addresses a real world problem, and they're generally around, as I said, inclusivity, safety. The case around environmental still needs to be made quite strongly, I think, in my opinion, but that I think is one of how that could look like if it was designed well.
Thank you very much. Now, I promised our online colleagues to hear also from them. Brendan, if you want to read out 3 questions.
Thank you, Philip, and thanks to everyone who's joined us online. We've received a huge number of questions. To start off with, a question from Wuad, who asks, how will autonomous vehicles affect jobs such as taxi drivers, truck drivers, and delivery workers, and what responsibility do governments have to support displaced workers? Secondly, from Manish, if fairness is a core principle of transport policy, wouldn't it be unfair to prohibit controlled pilots of autonomous vehicles before evaluating the evidence? Shouldn't regulators assess the safety and performance outcomes and then decide? And lastly, looking beyond London and the UK, Alexander Stoll, the CEO of Spacescape, asks, what are the policy trends on autonomous cars in very advanced car-light cities such as Zurich, Singapore and Tokyo, and how does that reflect with London?
Thank you, Brandon. Let's use this as sort of a final input, and colleagues on the panel, if you want to add anything beyond in the spirit of concluding remarks, please also add those so we can close on time. Thank you. Glenn.
Gosh, those are some tough questions from the online crowd. And I'm not going to sit here pretending to be an employment expert, but I think the question about replacing jobs is interesting in a world where the very nature of jobs is changing all the time. There's some surprising statistics about the share of knowledge you acquire during a university degree being at all relevant to the job you thought you were training for and moving into. So there's a sense of flux around us all the time anyway. And I'm reminded when the mechanical loom was first invented, and it was, just images of it being destroyed by people who thought they were going to lose their jobs. And yet in the fullness of time, and I think the question's well made about how you provide repurposing for people's careers. When the coal mines were being closed in the UK, as I understand it, and other industries spotted the skill set that coal miners had, or the industry had, which was actually eminently transferable into a different type of production or manufacturing setting. So I think there are real opportunities there. And since we're in kind of wrap-up mode, I just wanted to mention, I know that Waymo is not Google, but they're part of the Alphabet group. But when mobility as a service was being hyped at the same time as autonomous vehicles, I found myself walking around London with my new pair of desert boots, which I've still got, and realized for 2 days I had not needed any mechanical form of transport. I just walked, and I called it walking as a service because I had Google Maps with me. And it started as a joke, but I then researched it in more detail. And what I came to realize was that Google isn't selling mobility. That's why it's so brilliant. It's selling access to geography. And I've got a distinct hunch that what might be going on here has got very little to do with a future of autonomous vehicles. It's a move by Silicon Valley and the Alphabet Group to further deepen their capability to make sense of monetizing geography by geofencing and micro-detailing understanding of the urban environments. What a great place to do that in one of the financially vibrant parts of the world, such as London. That's scaremongering speculation, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, a very sensible way of analyzing what's maybe going on in reality. Thank you, Glenn, for sharing that. Rebecca?
Yeah, absolutely. If I can try and go to the, I don't know why I'm looking over there, but I realise it's online, so I feel like I needed to answer the question to someone. Apologies. The point around fairness, actually, I think that's a really interesting challenge around should we actually control what is going on. I think that as long, potentially controversial, as long as pilots are being used as part of that continuous development and that learning process and feeding back in, and there are mechanisms for feedback so that we are learning from things, then that's a really fair challenge. Because one of the problems we have is that there's so many things that are done and no one knows about it. A few years later, you rinse and repeat, and you're like, the null hypotheses, we've all learned about it. And so actually, I think that those trials and those pilots have a really important role to play, because it's as important to know what doesn't work as what does, to make sure that we're not just repeating the same things time and time again. It goes back to the point, one of the kind of learnings we got from some research that we did was that the public don't want an overnight introduction to any kind of automation, regardless of what the use case is. Actually, the idea of sort of trialing that expands slowly, if it works, where there is the ability to sort of retract if it doesn't, regulate more in areas where there are concerns, actually really matches that kind of idea of building a system that matches acceptability, which is about building something that is worthy of trust. So it's a really, I don't know why apologies, I keep looking over there, but I think it's a really fair challenge of pilots and experimentation has a really important role to play, as long as it is feeding back into that continuous knowledge base, so that we can we're not repeating the same mistakes in 20 years' time and re-having a same panel about similar things, because we didn't learn and that data and insights weren't shared. And I think as a sort of closing remark, that sort of ties in really well, which is we need to make sure that what we are focusing on is how do we really solve the challenges of both today but also tomorrow, so that we're not constantly on the back foot trying to play catch up over barriers that could have been solved or problems that could have been removed if we'd really looked at what the exam question was in the first place. Thank you very much. Isabel and then Sam.
I was just going to make, they're very loosely connected to the questions, 2 quick points. If we, just on the assessing impacts and the pilots, the challenge that we need to collectively get through is that in this whole debate, there's a complete obsession with and fetishization of the full stack vehicle. What would actually be useful in an urban environment is level 1, level 2, level 3 automation in order to tackle the big residual issue in road safety in urban environments, which is not cars. It's pedestrians, motorbikes, cyclists. And trying to get any of these organizations interested in tackling that is not possible to date, really. And therefore, you really have to ask, where's the authenticity, to your point, Glenn, in the interest in getting into this space? Because, a kind of lower level of automation in order to then tackle some real issues is not something that we can get into a productive dialogue on. What does that tell you about this whole question? And the other thing on the jobs front is just, I used to always like this statistic that 80%, obviously, who knows if it's true, but I think it is. I'll just keep saying it. 80% of public space in London is the transport network, because the road network plus the, tube, et cetera, is a huge number. So when we think about what kind of a society we want to live in, what's the public realm in which we are operating, what is our democratic community and our democratic space, transport is 80% of that. So if we want to have automated, private, human-free movement in that public space, that's something we want to just think about as a society.
Very good, Isabel. And Sarah.
Great. I'll touch a little bit, I guess, on what are the policies in international cities that were asked. They vary. Like, everyone is really figuring it out as they go. I think you've seen in, you know, major cities in China, they're issuing permits to multiple different companies after going through pretty robust processes of like safety evaluation and getting the firms to share as much data about their existing tests and pilots as private companies are willing to share, and then trying to build up relationships as they go through those pilots to then build more permanent and longer lasting operations, really. But I think the end point that I want to land on actually goes to the question that came before, which is really about what causes the misalignment a little bit between the government and private companies. And I think, having spent my career mostly on the private company side and being in that belly of the beast, there's only so much that private companies want to tell public governments about their operations. And when it comes to technology that is as nascent and misunderstood as autonomous vehicles, being opaque is a tool that private companies use when they speak with public governments. There's a lot of information that just isn't shared, and it's not just the data about how things, you know, exist in the real world in those pilots, it's also information about how that technology was built, what is informing the algorithms. All of that is seen as commercially sensitive, and public sectors that are being asked to trust what has been developed for private profit don't have access to that information. And so it's also a case of, if you want to come and play a game in the public realm, you have to be able to like stand up with your spine straight and say that you have the public's best interest at heart and that you can share this information. And I think there's a lot of private companies that just don't take that approach more generally, and I think everyone would benefit, including the companies and their bottom line, if they could be a little bit more transparent about what's going on. And I think cities themselves need to be a little bit more comfortable being uncomfortable, asking for that level of data and asking for the private companies to actually, you're trying to make a profit. It's okay. We live under capitalism. Everyone knows it. But like being a little bit more transparent about how things are developed and bringing people along throughout that process, I think would go a really long way.
Great. Thank you very much. Now, before we bring this to a close, one final vote from all of you. And the scenario is the following. You have heard that we need to really discuss this more. You're invited to an event, which we may want to call a panel, a citizen assembly, a mini public, by the Greater London Authority and Transport for London, to really think hard about what does London want and need in relation to autonomous vehicle. Who in the audience would come and spend a weekend on this topic? Please raise your hand. All right, so I think we have a mission. Thank you very much. Good, so this brings me now to concluding this. I have endless amounts of notes. I will not repeat too much, but there are 5 points I want to make on substance, and then I come on to the thanks. Clearly, we need to broaden the discussion on autonomous vehicle away from robo-taxis. We have heard very strong pushes towards mixed fleet, thinking about the last mile, Rebecca's example of Outer Paris, the example there, filling really interesting niche is something to think about much more. We heard about driving is a great job. Now that goes to the heart of the challenge because yes, autonomous vehicles are taking the drivers out of the equation. There are different rationales for it. Road safety may be one, the costs of a driver may be another one. Of course, if you go to the wonderful system in East London, now I'm blanking, the DLR, the Dockland Light Railway, it operates without a driver. But if I had to point to a system where I actually had real contact and conversations with people who operate the train, it's that one. Because they run around, sometimes they open the front and put their key in and magically start driving this vehicle. But there is a much more interactive form of feeling taken care of compared to the tube, where you actually never meet the driver. So there's a question about that. Road safety, we have to take very clear and central, but we need to come real about what the different policy options do. And the Welsh example by Glenn, I mean, should really tell us all we need to know. If we cannot have a road safety proposition if we're not talking about speed limits in cities. I mean, that's sort of the basic standard to begin with. And in fact, it probably helps even autonomous vehicles if they only need to drive at 30 kilometers an hour. You need a lot less tech. Some people say all you need is a few cameras to do that. And if they do have accidents, probably not too bad either. Isabel, your point on urban institutions, absolutely central. We're overwhelmed with these new technologies, these institutions, and we need to think much harder about how do we bring this into a system that can actually be responsive and has the intellectual as well as the technological opportunity to push back, to guide, to steer, to also put something on the table. Rebecca's point about the design of the vehicles and that we're currently still missing the main opportunity of making them truly inclusive should really worry us, because the London taxis certainly have done this and historically have a fantastic track record of really inviting inclusive mobility, probably better than any other taxi service worldwide. And finally, back to your vote, proper deliberation is key. This brings me to the closing. Many thanks to my colleague Charlie Hicks, maybe he's online, who helped me prepare this event, Brendan O'Boyle, Jennifer Ho, Diva Waring, and our wonderful LSE stewards, the most reliable event contributors here at the London School of Economics. And then, of course, massive thank you to our panel, Glenn, Rebecca, Sarah, and of course, our wonderful colleague from the GLA. Man, it's late. Isabel. Thank you so much. I'll put you back.